welcome to this video overview of the MAD South Carolina 2020 Court Monitoring Report that we call Refusal to Change. My name is Stephen Burritt. I'm the Executive Director for MAD South Carolina. Thanks for taking a few minutes to check out this video where we talk about the important findings. We think this is really important work that we're doing. It's been almost 2 years since our last statewide report, and we've been working hard to collect these data and put together some really, we think, well thought out and impactful suggestions for how South Carolina can move forward on the issue of DUI prosecution and adjudication. First, let me describe when we say court monitoring, what it is that we mean. For us, court monitoring is a systematic effort to determine and share the outcomes of first offense misdemeanor DUI cases. And in this case, we're currently focused on 7 of the large counties in South Carolina. And that's where we are monitoring cases. When possible, we are there in person, actually listening to the deliberations and the judge ruling and taking notes. And that's what we're recording. Sometimes, however, we can't be everywhere. We're trying to cover 7 large counties with a relatively small team. And so often we're having to track cases online using public information that's available, both to find out where the DUI cases are and then to know what actually happens to them. So through a mix of in-person and online court monitoring, we've accumulated quite a large number of data over the years for these 7 counties, and we're glad to finally be able to share that. Let me start by saying that when we share these data for these 7 counties, that is not the actual every DUI arrest that has taken place over the years in those counties. Again, we simply don't have the capacity to be there for all of those cases. And also, we're somewhat restricted to monitoring in the courts where public information is available. So many courts use the public index. That's one place where we can go to find, public criminal record information. Other jurisdictions don't, and they don't put that information necessarily on kind of a public website where you can access it. So unfortunately, we don't go to those places just because we don't have access to the information. We also typically go to the larger courts where they're going to hear a lot of DUIs when they are in session, just so it makes our time the most efficient that it can be. So when we say for this county or that county, we have a certain conviction rate, just know in essence, we're saying that of the cases that we monitored, these are the percentage that may have been found guilty or dropped or dismissed or pled down. If a particular agency says they track their own internal conviction rates and they say it is whatever percent they say it is, they absolutely could be right with that. Again, we're just able to report on what we can. So let's go ahead and dive into a little bit more of the background of what we looked into, and then actually get to some of the findings for the 7 counties where we monitored. So in total for these 7 counties, we've monitored just over 4,100 cases, so quite a lot of data. Now, not all of those are what we call closed cases, meaning not all of them have come to a final outcome yet. They may be pending jury trial, or some of them may have been relatively recent arrests, and they just haven't gotten to them yet. But in terms of closed cases, we have 2,678. And you can see the breakdown there on your screen for the 7 counties where we're currently monitoring of how many cases we have by county. Now, I should note that we have not been working in each of these counties an equal amount of time. For Richland and Greenville, we've been monitoring cases as far back as the beginning of 2016 in those areas. For Charleston, Horry, and Berkeley, we started at the beginning of 2018 in those counties. And for Lexington and Spartanburg, it's only been since the beginning of 2019. So to some degree, that explains the size of the number of cases, because generally when we've been someplace less, we have fewer cases. But it also has something to do with the number of DUI arrests in that area and how easily accessible the information is from the public index that we can find out about. Now, it's important to note that while we're looking at these 7 counties, they are very different in how they prosecute cases. But before we can go into that, let me note that these 7 counties where we're monitoring were not selected based on any specific complaints or problems we knew of in terms of how cases end up in the end. We chose these counties completely based on crash data. So fatalities and serious injury DUI data over a number of years. We use those to help drive where we're at. And largely that took us to the largest counties because that's where the most crashes do occur. But then once we got in those counties and learned about how things are done, we found that there are some very different situations. So in a county like Lexington, Greenville, and Spartanburg, again, in the courts where we monitor, pretty much all the cases are handled by the solicitor's office So there is a lawyer prosecutor, attorney prosecutor doing handling those cases. When we're monitoring in a county like Horry, again, the courts where we are, typically, virtually every time we see a case being brought before a judge, it's the officer prosecuting their own case. Now, in counties like Charleston and Berkeley, it's a bit of a mix from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. So one town might have a hired prosecutor that does the cases, but then maybe in another part of the county, when we go there, we see the officers doing their own cases. And then in Richland County, we kind of put it in its own category of kind of being a mix. It seems like over the years, they have had more and more cases being done by the solicitor's office, whereas it used to be primarily officers doing their own cases. Enough now to where we just kind of call it a mix. Because one thing we have to note is unless we're in court for that case, which often we are, but we can't be there all the time, then typically the public record does not indicate who is the prosecutor. So we just have to go off based on generalizations of what we typically see when we are in the county. But in the end, we end up boiling down all the outcomes of these cases into 3 categories. The first one are those who are guilty. So they were found guilty of DUI or guilty of a charge called driving with an unlawful alcohol concentration, or DUAC, which is a little too detailed to get into here, but it's the same thing as a DUI. There's only minor differences. The penalties are essentially the same. If you get a second DUI later after having a DUAC, it counts as a second DUI. So we consulted with a lot of the experts locally, and they all agreed that we should probably count it all the same. This also includes those who may have been arrested at a BAC of, say, 0.17, but the final charge that they plead guilty to is a BAC at between 0.08 and 0.10. And if that sounds strange, just know that is something that happens. Sometimes the final BAC that you get charged with is not what you that you get convicted of is not what you actually blew into the machine. So we lump all those and just call them all guilty for the simplicity. The next category are those that are pled down to a lesser charge, like reckless driving typically is what it is. We call those pled down cases because it's not as serious as getting a DUI, and the penalties are certainly much less. And then the final category is a mix of things that we call drop, dismissed, and not guilty. We put all those together because what they have in common is basically we were following a case in the public index, again, the online records, and then we couldn't find it anymore. So it could be that a prosecutor decided to drop the case. It could be that a judge dismissed the case. It could be that they were found not guilty on a day when we were not in court. And then the court staff immediately takes them out of the system if that's the case. And then when we go back and we can't find it anymore, we don't necessarily know exactly what happened because we weren't there. So unfortunately, these are different things that we all have to kind of put into this one category. But again, it all comes back to the fact that something happened to where this case is no longer in the system. And of course, if they were found guilty of something, it would be in the system either as a DUI or a reckless driving. So something else happened. And so we put that in its own category. All right, so all that said, let's finally look at the 7 counties where we have monitored with this project. Going in alphabetical order, for Berkeley County, to this point, we have 215 closed cases, and we find that 42% of them were found guilty. About a third were dropped, dismissed, not guilty, and a little smaller percentage were pled down. For Charleston County, we see our guilty percentage that we have is 46% of the 414 cases, and a little roughly similar for the drop, dismissed, and the pled down as we saw on the previous slide. For Greenville County, we see a conviction rate of 47% on the 777 DUI cases that we've tracked. About 44% were pled down, and on this one, a smaller number, just under 10%, were dropped, dismissed, or not guilty. For Horry County, we see 29% of the 388 cases that we've tracked were found guilty. 43% were pled down, 28% dropped, dismissed, or not guilty. For Lexington County, just under 50%, 46% were found guilty of the 263 cases that we looked at. A slightly higher percentage pled down, and a small percentage were in the drop, dismissed, not guilty category. For Richland County, we have 399 cases that we've been tracking. 30% of those came back as being guilty. Higher percentage, 36%, is pled down, and a third were dropped, dismissed, and not guilty. And finally, for Spartanburg County, 213 cases, we found that 67%, pretty much 2/3 of them, were found guilty, and then the smaller percentages in the pled down or dropped dismissed are not guilty. Now, those are the overall findings. We did combine the counties together and look at them in terms of the combinations of who's prosecuting and who's defending. We already talked a little bit about the differences in prosecution between the counties. Of course, sometimes people have an attorney representing them when they're defending themselves, and sometimes they defend themselves. So let's look at how it plays out based on who's involved in those. So when we look at lawyers on both sides, a lawyer prosecuting and a defense attorney representing the person, for 740 cases we looked at, we find that basically there was an equal percentage essentially of guilty and pled down, and then a smaller percentage dropped, dismissed, not guilty. But look how different it is when we look at the officer prosecuting going up against a defense attorney. There we see that only 13% of the cases were found guilty, with a huge 70% being pled down and 16% being dropped, dismissed, not guilty. So we see right there, there is a huge difference between who is prosecuting the case between those two categories. Then we look at when the lawyer prosecutor is going up against somebody defending themselves, and you would expect to see a higher guilty percentage for that. We do. We see about 63% overall of the 340 cases that fall into that category. And then when it's an officer prosecuting someone that's representing themselves, we see pretty much 50% of the time they're found guilty, and 28% pled down, 23%, and the drop, dismissed, not guilty. So we feel these are some pretty significant findings. And frankly, these are our data and things you don't really see talked about anywhere else. If you look for a statewide conviction rate, you're not going to find one. Again, some agencies may track their own conviction rates, but by and large, that's not something you can find. So we think we're doing some important work and contributing to some things that probably shock a lot of people. I think probably most people would be surprised and probably disheartened to learn that in 6 of the 7 counties where we're monitoring, there's not even a 50% conviction rate. And Matt will be the first to say, perhaps not 100% of people arrested for DUI should be found guilty. There's always the chance that something was done wrong or an officer judgment error, whatever it might be. But I don't think you can find many people who will tell you that they really believe that less than half of the people who are arrested in this state for DUI are not actually too impaired to drive their vehicle. It doesn't speak to bad arrests. It speaks to major problems with how complicated we make it, a complicated statute, asking too much of our officers, and not enough resources for our prosecutors. But that starts to get into all the things that we should do differently. And as we went around and we showed these results to lots of different local groups of law enforcement and prosecutors, we garnered some really valuable feedback about what can be done differently, what South Carolina needs to do. So in the 7 videos we'll be putting out after this, we're going to focus one at a time at 7 different areas of improvement and focus that we think our state needs to make. If we were to actually take these things seriously, if we were to look at these areas and make some changes, we could finally say that we are no longer a state that is refusing to change, and one where we're actually putting public safety at the forefront, because South Carolina is among the nation's worst states for drunk driving, and we need to do better. And we think there's some important things in this report that we put forward. So if you would like a full copy of the report, you're welcome to reach out to us either through our Facebook page with a direct message or emailing us at sc.state@mad.org. And we'd be glad to give you a copy of the report so you can read it. Thank you for taking the time to look at this video to hear about the overall data that we're putting out. And I hope you'll also stay tuned as we put out our other videos focusing on the various areas of recommendation that we need to make so South Carolina become a safer place to live and work.